Have you ever carried a truth so heavy it could save a life or destroy yours? That's the question that split Jolene Archer's world in two on a November night, when Chicago bled rain and sirens tore through the city like wolves hunting in the dark. Inside the Valenti estate in Lincoln Park, beneath vaulted ceilings and oil paintings worth more than most people's lifetimes, a 7-year-old girl lay unconscious, her lips the color of a bruised winter sky. Renzo Valenti, the man whose name made judges go silent and police look the other way, the man who controlled half of Chicago's real estate empire from the shadows and ruled an underworld that stretched from the Gold Coast to Las Vegas, stood at his daughter's bedside with hands that had broken men's bones now trembling against a child's fingers. He'd buried a wife 3 years ago, taken from him by enemies who wanted to break what they couldn't buy, and he'd sworn on her grave that nothing would ever touch their daughter. But here was Petra, slipping away breath by breath, and every doctor he'd summoned, every specialist money and fear could drag to her door, stood there shaking their heads with the same useless answer. 36 hours, doctor. Noel Vasquez had whispered. Maybe less. And I still don't understand what's happening to her. Confusion that came and went like fog. Crushing headaches that spiked every night after dark. A heartbeat that danced between steady and chaos. Blue lips on a child who should have been painting sunrises and laughing at cartoons. Every scan came back clean. Every blood panel read normal. And yet the most powerful man in Chicago couldn't buy the one thing he needed. An answer, because the answer wasn't in any hospital he owned or any doctor he controlled. It was across the city at St. Mercy General Hospital on the south side, locked inside the memory of a 27-year-old woman who mopped floors on the night shift, a woman named Jolene Archer, who was finishing her rounds in the third-floor corridor when the break room radio crackled to life, and a news anchor's voice cut through the bleach and silence. Mysterious illness strikes daughter of real estate mogul Renzo Valenti. Doctors baffled, blue lips, confusion, headaches worsening after sunset. Her mop clattered to the floor, her hands went cold. Those exact words. She'd heard them before. 5 years ago in a freezing apartment in Englewood, where a faulty heater hummed its poison through the walls. Her baby sister Bree, 16 years old with a laugh that could fill a room, had shown the same symptoms one by one before she died in Jolene's arms at 3 a.m, while an ambulance that came too late wailed outside like a prayer nobody heard. Carbon monoxide poisoning. Silent, invisible, deadly, and the doctors had called it flu. Jolene stared at her worn shoes, her cleaning cart beside her, her chapped hands still smelling of disinfectant. Nobody important. Nobody with a degree or a title or a name that opened doors. But she knew something that every powerful person in that little girl's life couldn't see. She'd paid for that knowledge with her sister's last breath. And this time, God help her, she wouldn't stay silent, even if speaking meant walking straight into the world of the most dangerous man in Chicago. A world where people who knew too much didn't live long enough to regret it. What happens when the only person who can save a child is someone the world has already decided doesn't matter? If this story moved you, hit that like button so more people can hear it. Share it with someone who needs to know that quiet voices can shake the loudest rooms. And subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because what Jolene did when she walked into that hospital changed everything. And not just for Petra Valenti. Jolene didn't think. She ran. She grabbed the thin jacket hanging behind the door of the janitorial supply room, shoved the note into the pocket of her scrubs, and walked out of St. Mercy General Hospital as if the building were burning behind her. November rain in Chicago wasn't gentle. It cut across her face like tiny blades, soaked through every thread of fabric, cold all the way to the bone. But Jolene felt nothing except her heartbeat pounding in her ears and Bree's face appearing every time she blinked. The L train station at 47th Street was deserted near midnight, only flickering fluorescent lights, and a man slumped asleep on a plastic bench. Jolene stood on the platform, her hand clenched around the cold, wet metal railing, waiting for the northbound train, toward the Gold Coast, toward a world people like her were never invited into. The train arrived with its familiar metallic shriek, and she stepped on, sat in the very last row by the window, watching Chicago slide past in smeared streaks of light under the rain. From the south side to the Gold Coast, the city changed mile by mile, shuttered storefronts giving way to glass facades glowing with light, cracked sidewalks turning into polished granite, and Jolene felt herself growing smaller with every stop. Lakewood Memorial Hospital appeared after the final curve like a palace in the night. Glass walls, floodlights washing the facade, a parking lot full of black sedans and gleaming SUVs, each one worth more than her yearly pay. Jolene pushed through the revolving door into the reception lobby and immediately felt every gaze stick to her wrinkled St. Mercy scrubs, her worn sneakers soaked with rain, her hair plastered to her forehead. The reception desk was white marble, and the woman behind it looked at Jolene the way people look at a stain on a freshly mopped floor. "How can I help you?" The voice was polite, but the eyes weren't. Jolene swallowed, forced her voice louder, though it still came out smaller than she wanted. "Petra Valenti, the girl in the ICU. I think I know what's wrong with her." The receptionist blinked, then glanced down at the scrubs again. "Are you a doctor here?" "No. I work nights at St. Mercy General, janitorial, but I studied environmental engineering before I had to quit, and I think she has carbon monoxide poisoning." The pause stretched just long enough for Jolene to feel the weight of it. The receptionist smiled, the kind of smile reserved for a child saying something foolish. "Ma'am, this is a private medical facility. We have the top physicians in the state of Illinois caring for our patients." Jolene pulled the note from her pocket, her hands shaking so hard the handwriting danced on the crumpled page. "Please, just give this to the doctor. Tell them to check carboxyhemoglobin levels and inspect the indoor pool heating system. The ventilation could be blocked. It happened to my sister. The symptoms were exactly the same." The receptionist took the note between two fingers as if it were smeared with something dirty. "I'll pass it along to the appropriate party." In the reflective glass behind the desk, Jolene saw it clearly. So clearly it hurt. The woman dropped the note into the trash the instant she turned away. Gentle and final, like letting a fallen leaf go. Jolene hadn't even turned back when a tall figure blocked her path. Terry Washington. She read the name on the badge clipped to his black suit. But it was his eyes she noticed first. Not as cold as she'd expected. Almost sympathetic, though his voice was firm and left no room to bargain. "Ma'am, you're not authorized to be in this area. I need you to leave right now." "Please," Jolene whispered. "Just 5 minutes. I know what's killing her." Terry looked at her a beat longer than necessary, and Jolene felt he was weighing something behind those eyes. But then he shook his head. "This is a private hospital, with private security and private rules, and you're from another facility. You can't access our ICU. I'm sorry." He said sorry like he meant it, and somehow that hurt more than the receptionist's indifference. The rain welcomed her back outside like a cruel old friend. Jolene crossed the street and sat on the stone bench opposite the hospital, rainwater running down her back, soaking layer after layer until she couldn't tell what was rain, what was cold, what was exhaustion. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. A message from Phil Dorsey. "Where are you?" "Third floor needs staff now." Jolene stared at the glowing screen in the dark, her frozen fingers typing each word. "Family emergency. Requesting leave." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but not as bitter as the memory rising up. Bree lying on the narrow bed in their Englewood apartment. Jolene at 22 sitting beside her holding her sister's hand. The doctor at the free clinic saying it was just the flu. Give her fever reducers and rest. And Jolene had believed it. Believed it because she was just a kid, and they were doctors, and doctors had to be right. Until the morning she woke, and Bree's hand in hers was cold, stiff, and the ambulance siren outside sounded like the whole world crying too late. Jolene sat on the soaked stone bench, looking at Lakewood Memorial blazing like a lighthouse across the street. Warm, brilliant, and completely out of reach. And she thought, not this time, not this time. She wouldn't let another child die while she sat outside believing she wasn't important enough to be heard. 2 hours passed on that soaked stone bench, and Jolene didn't leave. She sat watching Lakewood Memorial, counting each lit window, wondering which one was the ICU, which one belonged to a place where a 7-year-old girl was slowly dying while no one understood why. And during those 2 hours she observed the way only hospital janitorial staff know how to observe, because when your job is to be invisible, you learn to see everything others overlook. She saw a laundry cart roll out through a side door along the building. Not the main entrance, not the emergency bay, but the service entrance, the service corridor, the kind every hospital has and places in the same spot, along the side near staff parking, usually not locked from the outside, because workers need constant access. Jolene knew this the way she knew her own name, because she'd passed through hundreds of doors like it at St. Mercy over the past 5 years, and every hospital looks the same when you see it from behind the scenes. She stood up, legs numb, scrubs heavy with rain, and crossed the street. The side entrance led into a narrow hallway, washed in pale yellow light. White walls faded to cream, linoleum floors identical to St. Mercy's, and the familiar scent of bleach so strong Jolene almost felt she belonged there. She lowered her head, angled her St. Mercy badge outward just enough that a quick glance read hospital badge, not close enough to read the facility name, and walked with the rhythm of someone at work, not too fast, not too slow, the gait of custodial staff who belong everywhere and nowhere. But Lakewood Memorial wasn't St. Mercy. Jolene realized that when she turned into the hallway leading to the fourth-floor ICU and saw two men in black suits standing by the elevator, earpieces in place, eyes scanning the space in a way that didn't belong to hospital employees but to men paid to guard someone far more important than an ordinary patient. Jolene slipped into a supply closet before their gaze reached her. The door closed. Darkness wrapped around her among shelves of linens and sanitizer bottles, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it might carry through the door. Voices drifted through the crack, the two men talking, and she held her breath to listen. "The boss hasn't slept in 3 nights," one voice low. "If the girl doesn't make it, this city will burn. Trust me. I've worked for him 8 years. I've never seen him like this. Not even when Mrs. Marin died was he like this." Jolene pressed her back to the wall, feeling each word land on her like a stone. She was stepping into the territory of a man whose name even paid loyalists feared to speak. Yet beneath the fear, she heard something else in the guard's voice. Not pure terror, but worry. The kind that comes from knowing your employer is losing the last thing keeping him human. The men moved on, footsteps fading. Jolene counted to 30 before opening the door, checking left and right, the hallway empty. She moved faster now, following discreet signage only staff notice. A small arrow labeled ICU Private Wing, pointing left at the end of the corridor. The private ICU was so quiet she heard the steady beeping of monitors through the glass before she saw the room. She stopped at the window, pressed her palm to the cold surface, and looked inside. A white bed, blinking machines, and at the center a tiny girl, dark hair fanned across the pillow, skin so pale it was nearly translucent, lips tinged a blue-purple Jolene had seen once in her life, and never forgotten. Then Petra opened her eyes. Weak, unfocused, those large dark eyes scanned the ceiling before slowly turning toward the glass, toward Jolene, and somehow, through the barrier, through the distance, through everything the world had placed between two people who were never meant to meet, the girl's eyes found hers. A nurse inside noticed, bent close to Petra, then followed her gaze to the window. The nurse stepped out, face cautious but not hostile. "Who are you?" Jolene didn't say she was a doctor, didn't claim she had a right to be there, didn't speak a single lie. "I'm someone who wants to help her." The nurse looked at the soaked scrubs, looked at Jolene's eyes, and hesitated. 2 minutes. She keeps calling for her mother, but her mother died 3 years ago. Maybe she thinks. The nurse didn't finish the sentence. She just opened the door. Jolene stepped inside and the hospital smell here was different, cleaner, sweeter, more expensive. But the sound of the monitor was the same. Beep, beep, beep. The countdown rhythm she'd last heard at Bree's bedside. Jolene pulled a chair close, and Petra's small hand reached out. Fragile, trembling, tiny fingers, searching for hers. Jolene took it, gentle, careful, as if holding something so precious, even breathing too hard might shatter it. "Are you an angel?" Petra's voice was paper-thin. "Mom said angels have kind eyes." Jolene bit her lip to keep from crying. "I'm not an angel, sweetheart. Just someone who doesn't want you to stop seeing the sunrise." "What's a sunrise?" "I'm always sleeping. Dad says I need to rest." Petra shifted slightly, still holding Jolene's hand, the other pointing to the bedside table, where a folded drawing lay. "Can you open it for me?" Jolene took the paper, unfolded it, and her heart skipped a beat. A crayon drawing. 7-year-old lines, crooked but unmistakable. A woman with white wings, standing beside a hospital bed, and behind her in the sky a streak of orange-gold Jolene instantly recognized as dawn. "I drew it yesterday," Petra whispered. "I dreamed someone would come." Jolene looked at the picture, at the girl, at the blue-purple lips identical to Bree's in her memory, and everything inside her broke at once. 5 years of pain, guilt, helplessness, and from the wreckage, something new began to grow, harder than fear, stronger than doubt. She wouldn't let this child die. "My sister loved the sunrise," Jolene said, her voice shaking but holding. "She used to drag me up to the roof before dawn, saying every sunrise is proof the night will pass." Petra squeezed her hand tighter. When I get better, will you watch the sunrise with me? Jolene looked into those wide, dark eyes filled with the absolute trust of a 7-year-old who believed the stranger entering her room at midnight was the angel her mother promised would come, and she said, "I promise." Less than 10 seconds after the promise left Jolene's lips, the ICU door flew open with enough force to make the stainless steel tray on the instrument table tremble. Jolene didn't need to turn around to feel it. The air in the room changed, heavier, denser, as if someone had sucked the oxygen out simply by stepping inside. Renzo Valenti stood in the doorway, and he didn't resemble any father Jolene had ever imagined. 6'2", shoulders filling the frame, a black suit without a single wrinkle despite 3 sleepless nights, and eyes the color of winter steel sweeping the room before locking onto Jolene with the weight of a verdict. Behind him was Fausto Carbone, 50 years old, silver hair slicked back to perfection, an expensive charcoal suit, a lean, angular face showing nothing but cold calculation, and ink-dark eyes studying Jolene the way a snake studies prey before deciding whether it's worth the bite. 2 more bodyguards stood behind them, sealing the exit, and in an instant Jolene understood she was trapped in a room with the most dangerous men she had ever stood near. "Who are you?" Renzo's voice was low, not raised. It didn't need to be. The kind of voice so accustomed to command that even a whisper froze the room. Jolene sprang to her feet, instinctively shrinking, but Petra's hand clutched hers and didn't let go. Fausto stepped level with Renzo, his tone as sharp as a scalpel. She trespassed, into a guarded area, into a private ICU room, without authorization, without credentials, without permission. Fausto turned to Renzo, lowering his voice but not enough for Jolene to miss it, speaking a few words in Italian before switching back to English. "Could be Briggs's people, could be a plant. The Irish have tried everything to get close to your family, and now a janitor just appears in your daughter's hospital room at midnight. Don't you find that suspicious?" Jolene felt the blood drain from her face. Briggs. She didn't know the name, didn't know what it meant in this world, but she understood the way Fausto said it, like naming a disease, and she knew being linked to that name in this room could be the last thing that ever happened to her. Then Petra spoke, her voice weak but clear enough to silence the room. "Daddy, she knows. She knows what's wrong with me. Please don't make her go." Renzo looked down at his daughter, at the small hand gripping the stranger's, at the angel drawing lying open on the bed, and something in those steel eyes shifted. Not softening. Renzo Valenti didn't soften for anyone, but changing direction, like the barrel of a gun turning from one target to another. He looked at Jolene, really looked. This was a man who'd spent his life reading people, separating truth from lies, judging enemies in seconds to decide whether they lived or died, and he was reading Jolene now, the soaked scrubs, the worn shoes, the cracked hands holding his daughters with a gentleness money couldn't buy, and the eyes not of a spy or a liar, but of someone who'd seen death and was trying to stop it from happening again. "Speak," Renzo said, his voice still cold, but the door now cracked open. "You have 60 seconds. Jolene swallowed, and in those 60 seconds, she spoke faster than she ever had in her life. "Your daughter has carbon monoxide poisoning. The most likely source is the indoor pool heating system at your estate. The exhaust vent may be cracked or blocked, allowing CO to leak into the main ventilation. Her bedroom is upstairs closest to the vents, so she inhaled the highest concentration, especially at night when the heating runs stronger. That's why her symptoms worsen after dusk." Fausto opened his mouth to interrupt, but Jolene didn't stop. "The doctors have been monitoring pulse oximetry and seeing SPO2 readings in the normal 98 to 99% range. But that's the trap. Pulse oximeters measure light absorption and can't distinguish oxyhemoglobin from carboxyhemoglobin. It reads normal, even when the patient is being poisoned. You need co-oximetry, a specialized blood test. It will show the true carboxyhemoglobin levels. I know this because my sister died from this exact thing 5 years ago. Same symptoms, same blue lips, same headaches, same confusion, and no one checked until it was too late." Silence fell, the kind so heavy Jolene could hear the monitor beeping each second like a countdown on Petra's life. Dr. Noel Vasquez stood in the doorway. She'd arrived unnoticed and listened to every word, and her expression shifted from skepticism to thought to something close to shock. "She's right," Dr. Vasquez said, her voice professional but lightly trembling. "Scientifically, she's correct. Standard pulse oximetry measures light absorption, but doesn't differentiate between oxyhemoglobin and carboxyhemoglobin. We've been tracking SpO2 continuously, but if this is truly carbon monoxide poisoning, the readings would appear normal even at dangerous levels. I should have thought of this sooner. Fausto stepped forward, his tone cold and final. This is absurd. We will not reorganize medical protocol based on the theory of someone without credentials, without authority, without any legitimate reason to be in this facility. All equipment at the estate was inspected and certified safe by licensed contractors. I personally supervised that process. Jolene looked at Fausto, and for a split second she saw something flicker in his eyes when he said inspected and certified, safe, brief, almost invisible. But she'd spent her life watching people from corners no one noticed, and she recognized the face of someone hiding something. She didn't say it. Not yet. Renzo looked at Jolene, at Dr. Vasquez, at Fausto, and finally down at Petra, his 7-year-old daughter. Blue-tinged lips, tiny hand still gripping a stranger's like a lifeline in a dark sea. "Run the test," Renzo said, his voice flat but carrying the weight of an execution order. "Now." Fausto started to speak. "Renzo, this is," I said now. "And if you question my daughter's life one more time, Fausto, you won't like what happens next." Fausto closed his mouth, but his dark eyes slid to Jolene, and the calculation was gone, replaced by something sharper, more dangerous, the hatred of a man just threatened by the existence of someone who should never have been here. Dr. Vasquez was already moving, ordering nurses to prepare blood draw for co-oximetry, and in that quiet chaos, Renzo stepped closer to Jolene, close enough for her to smell expensive cologne and tobacco and something darker, power or danger or both, and his voice dropped so only she could hear. "If you're wrong, you've wasted my time, and I don't forgive that. If someone sent you, I'll find out, and you don't want to know what I do to liars." Jolene met those gray eyes, and she didn't know where the courage came from. Maybe from Bree, maybe from the angel drawing on the bed, maybe from the tiny hand still holding hers, but she spoke and her voice didn't shake. "And if I'm right, your daughter lives. Isn't that worth the risk?" Renzo held her gaze for 1 beat, 2, 3 heartbeats long as a lifetime, and Jolene didn't blink. And for the first time in many years, a person outside his world dared to look straight into Renzo Valenti's eyes without lowering their head. The ICU fell into the kind of silence that exists only in places where people wait for judgment between life and death. Dr. Vasquez drew blood from Petra's tiny arm, and Jolene watched the dark red vial get labeled and sent away, as if it were a letter carrying the answer to everything she'd held inside for 5 years. Renzo stood motionless by the window with his back to the room, but Jolene could see his reflection in the glass, jaw clenched, eyes unblinking, hands curled into fists inside his pockets, and she recognized this as the way a man accustomed to controlling everything faces the moment he controls nothing. Fausto stood in the opposite corner with a phone to his ear, speaking quietly in Italian, and now and then, his ink-black eyes slid toward Jolene with a look she couldn't read, but that sent a chill up her spine. Jolene sat beside Petra's bed with the girl's hand still in hers, and she prayed. Not that she was right, but that if she was right, it wasn't already too late, because she knew better than anyone that being right and being in time are 2 entirely different things. 17 minutes. 17 minutes was how long it took Dr. Vasquez to return with the results, but it felt as long as a lifetime. The door opened, and Jolene didn't need to see the doctor's face to know, because her footsteps were different, faster, sharper, and when she spoke, there was a tremor only seasoned medical professionals recognize as the fear of someone realizing they nearly lost a patient by missing what was right in front of them. Carboxyhemoglobin, 32%. Those 4 words hit the room like 4 bullets. Dr. Vasquez continued, her voice professional, though the hand holding the report shook slightly. "This is a life-threatening level. She's been inhaling carbon monoxide for days, possibly weeks. At this concentration, there's a high risk of brain injury if we don't act immediately. She needs hyperbaric oxygen therapy now. Every minute counts." Renzo turned from the window, and his face was something Jolene would never forget. Not anger. Not yet. It was the moment before anger. The moment a father realizes his daughter has been poisoned inside the very home he swore to keep safe, and everything inside him reorders itself, every priority reshuffled, every boundary redrawn, until at the center there is only one thing left. His daughter must live. Prepare the hyperbaric chamber. Renzo told Dr. Vasquez, then turned to Terry Washington standing outside the door. Lock down the estate. No one in or out. I want the indoor pool heating system torn apart tonight. Find the source of the leak, and get me the name of the contractor who certified that system as safe. Terry nodded and disappeared. The medical team moved quickly. Petra's bed was rushed out of the ICU toward the pressure treatment wing, and Jolene had to let go of her hand. The tiny fingers slipped from hers inch by inch, and Petra looked back over her shoulder with wide, dark, frightened eyes, and Jolene said loudly enough for her to hear, "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. I promised." Then the bed turned the corner, and Petra vanished from sight, and Jolene stood there alone in the empty ICU room, and 5 years collapsed all at once. She cried. For the first time in 5 years, Jolene Archer cried. Not quietly, not just wet eyes blinked away, but the kind of sob that breaks loose from somewhere so deep she didn't know it still existed. The cry of the 17-year-old girl holding her sister's freezing body at 3 a.m. that she'd locked away and swallowed and buried alive for 5 years. She cried because this time she'd been in time. She cried because Bree hadn't. She cried because 32% meant Petra had been so close to death that a few more days would have made saving her impossible. And the difference between in time and too late was simply a janitor sitting in the rain for 2 hours on a stone bench and deciding not to give up. She didn't know Renzo was still there. He hadn't left when the medical team took Petra away. He stayed, and he watched Jolene cry. Men in Renzo's world don't cry. Women in Renzo's world cry to manipulate. But what he was seeing wasn't manipulation. It was real enough to hurt. And Renzo Valenti, a man who'd killed without blinking, who'd ordered entire empires destroyed without hesitation, stood there watching a janitor cry and didn't know what to do. He didn't touch her. He didn't offer comfort. He just stood there in silence. And somehow that silence was the kindest thing anyone had given Jolene in a very long time. When she finally looked up, eyes red, face wet, and saw him still there, she wiped her tears with the back of her cracked hand and said, "I'm sorry." Renzo looked at her, and his voice when he spoke was strange, lower, different, without its usual edge. "Don't apologize for saving my daughter." Then he turned away, pulled out his phone, and Jolene heard his voice return to cold steel as he spoke into it. "Assemble everyone. Full lockdown on the Lincoln Park estate. I want to know who signed off on the pool heating safety report. I want names, addresses, and backgrounds of everyone involved on my desk before morning. And I want Fausto at the estate when the inspection team arrives, personally, because he's the one who supervised the safety certification." He ended the call, and in the moment before he stepped out of the room, Jolene saw something on Renzo's face she was certain very few people in the world had ever seen. Cold fury. Not the kind that flares and burns out, but the cold kind. Slow, smoldering like carbon monoxide, invisible and patient and lethal. The fury of a boss who'd just discovered someone dared to threaten the only thing left in his life that he loved. Before dawn, Renzo's inspection team tore apart the indoor pool heating system at the Lincoln Park estate, and what they found turned cold fury into something even more dangerous: silence. The exhaust pipe running from the pool heater's heat exchanger to the exterior had cracked. Not a hairline fracture, but a long split nearly 2 feet in length along the weld, large enough that carbon monoxide didn't vent outside but flowed back into the house, feeding straight into the central ventilation system that distributed air to every room in the estate. Jolene was still at the hospital, sitting on a plastic chair in the hallway outside the hyperbaric treatment unit, where Petra lay inside the oxygen chamber, and when Terry called to report the inspection results under Renzo's orders, she listened without surprise, yet still felt nauseous. She'd known. She'd known from the moment she heard the details over the radio. But knowing and hearing confirmation are not the same. One is memory, and the other is a present reality that was killing a child. Terry added more, his voice on the phone low and heavy. Petra's bedroom was on the 2nd floor, directly above the mechanical room, closest to the main ventilation trunk in the entire house. During the day when the girl was in the living room or outside, the exposure was lower, so symptoms eased. At night, when Chicago temperatures dropped below freezing, the heating system ran at full capacity. Carbon monoxide accumulated in the enclosed space, while she slept, 8 straight hours breathing something colorless and odorless that was killing her brain cell by cell. But what chilled Jolene wasn't the crack. A crack could be an accident, deterioration, neglected maintenance. What froze her was what Renzo's team found next. A safety inspection report from 3 months earlier, signed by a licensed contractor named Morrison and Klein Mechanical, clearly stating the entire heating system met safety standards. No leaks detected. All exhaust lines functioning normally. Yet when the team cross-checked with archived backups inside the contractor's internal system, they found another report, the original, dated the same day 3 months ago, clearly stating the heat exchanger had a crack at the weld, required immediate replacement. The system failed safety standards and recommended shutdown until repaired. 2 reports. Same day, same contractor. One real, one fake. Someone had replaced the real report with a falsified one, and Jolene thought of Fausto Carbone's eyes when he'd said inspected and certified safe in the ICU hours earlier. The quick glance she'd caught, and she understood. Renzo understood faster. He didn't need Jolene to point it out. He'd spent his life reading people, and when the evidence landed in front of him, he connected the pieces in seconds. Fausto oversaw all estate maintenance procedures. Fausto approved reports. Fausto had access to the storage systems. Renzo had Morrison brought in, not invited, not scheduled, but brought, at 4 a.m, to the basement of Renzo's second estate in West Town, a place where conversations are never recorded, and no sound escapes the insulated walls. Jolene wasn't there and never knew exactly what happened in that room, but when Terry told her later, his voice carried something she recognized as the quiet horror of someone who'd seen many dark things and was still haunted. Morrison confessed to everything. It didn't take long. He said Fausto Carbone contacted him directly after receiving the original report, ordered it replaced with a clean version, promised triple the inspection fee, and explained the reason. The Lincoln Park estate was being used as collateral in a $200 million deal. Money laundered through a new real estate development Valenti Holdings was building in the Fulton Market District. If the safety report showed non-compliance, the asset would be revalued. The bank would freeze the loan. The deal would collapse. $200 million would vanish. And Fausto couldn't let that happen. Morrison said he asked Fausto, "But what about the girl? Mr. Valenti's daughter. She lives in that house." And Fausto replied, "The girl just has a cold. She'll get better. Nobody dies from a leaking vent pipe. Don't overthink it. Sign the report and take the money." Terry paused when he reached this part, and Jolene understood why. Nobody dies from a leaking vent pipe. Fausto had said that while Petra, 7 years old, was breathing poison every night in her own bedroom, her lips slowly turning blue, her brain suffering damage inch by inch, sliding toward death, and Fausto knew there was a problem, knew there was a leak, and chose $200 million over a child's life. Renzo said nothing after hearing Morrison's confession. Terry said his boss didn't smash anything, didn't shout, didn't order anyone killed, and that was the most terrifying part, because Terry had worked for Renzo 8 years, and knew that when Renzo shouted, he was still in control. When Renzo went silent, it meant something inside him had crossed beyond anger into a place without a name. Renzo sat alone in his study at the West Town estate after Morrison was taken away. Door closed, lights off, and Terry stood guard outside listening to absolute silence for nearly an hour. The man who'd built an empire from ashes, survived gang wars, buried his wife and sworn to protect his daughter, had just discovered that his right hand, the man he'd trusted 15 years, who sat at the family dinner table, who'd carried Petra when she was a baby, had been willing to let his daughter die for money, just like Briggs had killed Marin. The closest people are always the ones who can stab deepest, because they know exactly where to place the blade. When Renzo finally opened the study door after nearly an hour of silence, Terry said his boss looked like someone who'd died and come back. No pain, nothing left, only a cold emptiness. And behind that emptiness was something Terry didn't want to name, but Jolene understood when she heard it. The emptiness of a man who'd already decided, who knew exactly what he would do next, and for whom nothing in the world could change that decision. Jolene left Lakewood Memorial just as dawn was beginning to break, catching the first L train back to the south side with scrubs stiff from last night's rain and eyes swollen from crying, thinking the hardest part was over, thinking she'd done what needed to be done, that now she could return to her cramped studio in Englewood, sleep a few hours, then go back to St. Mercy for the night shift as if nothing had happened, as if she'd never stepped into Renzo Valenti's world, never held the Mafia Boss's daughter's hand, never looked the most dangerous man in Chicago straight in the eye without lowering her head. She was wrong. She realized it the moment she stepped off at 47th Street and saw a black sedan parked at the corner across from the station stairs. The kind of car that didn't belong in this neighborhood. Too clean, too new. Windows darkly tinted. And she wouldn't have noticed if she hadn't seen that exact type of car parked outside Lakewood Memorial the night before. Same model, same color, same slightly angled parking position, as if the driver wanted the best possible view. Jolene quickened her pace, not running because running would tell whoever was inside the car that she'd noticed, but faster, cutting through an alley shortcut only people who lived in Englewood knew, slipping past the iron fence behind the closed laundromat, circling the vacant lot, and reaching her apartment door by a route no car could follow. She locked the door, pulled the curtains, sat on the bed in the dark, and for the first time felt the full weight of what she'd done. She'd stepped into a world whose rules she didn't understand, had exposed the fault of a man she'd only glimpsed but long enough to know those eyes weren't the eyes of someone who accepted defeat, and now that world was looking back at her. Her phone vibrated. An unknown number. A message, not a call. She shouldn't have opened it. She knew she shouldn't have. But her finger swiped the screen before her mind could stop it. You should have stayed in your place. Some truths will kill the ones who know them. No signature. None needed. Jolene stared at the glowing words in the dark room and felt each one like a cold finger pressed to the back of her neck. She deleted the message, then wished she hadn't, because at least it was evidence. Then felt relief that she had, because she didn't want to see it for another second. She couldn't know then that Fausto Carbone was playing a much larger game than threatening a janitor. While Jolene curled in the darkness of her studio, Fausto was at a seafood restaurant in Bridgeport, territory the Briggs family considered their own, sitting across from Paxton Briggs in a private room behind the kitchen, and what the two men said over that dinner would shift the balance of Chicago's entire underworld. Fausto brought information. Renzo was vulnerable, his daughter critically ill, his focus split. Security concentrated on the hospital instead of operational routes, and most importantly, Renzo was beginning to suspect Fausto, which meant Fausto had little time before his former boss uncovered everything. Fausto proposed acting now, toppling Renzo while he was distracted, splitting the Valenti empire in two, Briggs taking casinos and transport, Fausto keeping real estate and laundering, a deal neither man could have imagined a week earlier. Fausto wasn't running from consequences. He was running forward, turning exposure into a coup, and the janitor from the south side who'd accidentally pulled the first thread unraveling his cover needed to disappear, not necessarily die, just vanish from the picture before she tugged another thread. Jolene didn't know any of this. She only knew about the black car, the message, and the cold feeling at her neck that didn't fade even when she pulled the blanket up to her chin. She lay in the dark with eyes open, listening to every sound in the old apartment, pipes groaning, footsteps from the upstairs neighbor, traffic outside, and every noise sounded like someone drawing closer. She was afraid enough to consider calling the police. But what would she say? That she'd broken into a private mafia hospital and was now being threatened. They'd laugh. Or worse, they'd know she was tied to the Valentis, and that would only make things worse. But Jolene hadn't collapsed. Not yet. She was afraid, but she still remembered Petra's face looking back over her shoulder as the hospital bed turned the corner, still remembered the angel drawing, still remembered the paper-thin voice asking if she'd watch the sunrise with her, and fear was large but the promise was larger, at least for now, at least tonight, while the darkness wasn't yet thick enough to swallow the last remaining piece of courage inside her. 3 days later, Jolene's world collapsed piece by piece like a rotten roof caving in under steady rain, and Fausto Carbone was the architect of that collapse. He worked fast, precise, and ruthless, in the way of a man who'd spent 15 years learning how to turn lies into truth in the eyes of the powerful. Fausto placed a thick brown envelope on Renzo's desk. Inside it, a dossier he'd constructed with meticulous care down to the smallest detail. Photographs of Jolene walking on the sidewalk near the Lincoln Park estate 3 days before Petra was hospitalized. The reality that she'd merely passed by on her way to the Italian restaurant where she washed dishes. But the images were cropped just well enough to turn a woman walking into a woman surveilling. Altered phone records showing Jolene had made 3 calls to a number Fausto linked to the Briggs network, entirely fabricated, yet detailed enough to appear credible. A written summary in Fausto's own hand, suggesting Jolene had researched the Valenti family before coming to the hospital, that her knowledge of carbon monoxide was too precise to be coincidence, that the Briggs family had tried every possible way to penetrate Renzo's inner circle since Marin was killed, and that an anonymous janitor appearing at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right answers, was precisely the kind of tactic Paxton Briggs would use. sending someone unassuming, someone invisible, someone Renzo would never see as a threat. Fausto presented it all in a voice thick with manufactured concern, the voice of a loyal lieutenant protecting his boss, and Renzo listened. Renzo, the man who'd lost his wife to a betrayal he hadn't seen coming, the man who carried the permanent scar of the one time he trusted the wrong person, listened to Fausto, studied the photos, read the phone records, and the paranoia seated by Marin's death 3 years earlier stirred awake like a monster rising from sleep. He couldn't accept the risk. Not with Petra. Never with Petra. Cut her off from the hospital, Renzo said, his voice flat like a frozen lake. No one from the outside gets access to my daughter anymore. Terry Washington received the order directly, and it was the hardest call of his career. Jolene, he said over the phone, his voice heavy, I can't explain everything, but you need to stay away. Away from the hospital. Away from the Valenti family. For your own safety. He said for your own safety in a way Jolene understood meant the opposite. Not that she was safe, but that she'd become a danger in the eyes of someone powerful enough to erase her. Jolene wanted to ask, to explain, to say she didn't know who Briggs was, didn't know anything about the underworld, that she was just a janitor who heard a radio report and remembered how her sister died, but Terry had already hung up and his number no longer connected. That same day, the manager of the Italian restaurant where Jolene washed dishes called her into the small office behind the kitchen, his face uncomfortable and refusing to meet her eyes. Someone called saying you'd been stealing tips from the servers, he said. I don't know if it's true, but I don't need trouble. You understand. End of the month, is it? Clear out your things. Jolene knew she hadn't stolen anything, knew the call wasn't random, but she had no money for a lawyer, no witnesses, nothing but cracked hands and the word of a janitor against an anonymous accusation. And in America, the word of the nameless weighs less than air. The next day, Phil Dorsey called her into the supervisor's office at St. Mercy, his face not angry but exhausted. Jolene, you missed a shift without notice. I received an anonymous call about concerning behavior. I don't want to fire you because you're a good worker, but I have to issue a formal warning. One more incident and I can't keep you. Jolene signed the warning with a shaking hand and said nothing, because she knew if she spoke she'd cry. And she'd already cried enough. Cried for the first time in 5 years in a hospital ICU. She didn't have tears left for another time, or so she thought. That afternoon, Jolene stood at the gates of Oakwood Cemetery in Greater Grand Crossing. November rain falling without pause, the patient cold kind as if the sky itself were trying to bury something. She walked past rows of dulled gray headstones, past unfamiliar names and dates marking other people's lives, until she stopped before the smallest stone in the section, the one she'd paid off in installments over 18 months, Bree Archer, the engraved letters already softening under Chicago weather. Jolene knelt, her knees sinking into the mud, rain running down her face, and she didn't wipe it away because mud and rain and tears had merged into something inseparable. Baby sister, she said to the stone, her voice breaking in the way only those who speak to the dead understand. I tried this time. I went to the hospital. I told them. I held her hand like I held yours. And they listened. This time they listened. And the little girl will live. But now they think I'm the bad one. They pushed me away. I lost my job. I lost everything. And I don't understand why every time I try to do the right thing, everything falls apart. Why I'm always the one punished for caring. Why this world keeps pushing me down whenever I try to stand up. She paused, breathing, rain falling into her mouth as she tilted her face toward the sky. Maybe I should just be invisible, Jolene whispered. Maybe that's my place. Scrubbing floors, lowering my head. Don't look, don't speak, don't know, don't care. Because every time I care, the people I love are taken from me, or I'm pushed so far away it's the same as losing them. She bowed her head, forehead nearly touching the ground, cold mud under her knees, cold rain on her back. And for the first time since Bree's death, Jolene Archer didn't feel anger, didn't feel sadness, didn't feel fear. She felt empty, the kind of emptiness that comes when you've tried too many times and been knocked down every time, the kind of emptiness where sometimes you don't get back up. And she thought this was the bottom, that it couldn't get any lower. But she'd been wrong about many things before, only this time she was right. This really was the bottom, and the only question left was whether anyone would come pull her up before the mud and rain and invisibility swallowed her completely. The knock came close to 10 o'clock at night, 2 days after the afternoon at Oakwood Cemetery, and Jolene almost didn't open the door because she hadn't opened it for anyone since returning from the cemetery. Not for delivery drivers, not for neighbors, not for the landlord reminding her rent was coming due. She'd just lain on the bed in the dark studio, staring at the ceiling, and trying not to think, not to remember, not to feel, but this knock was different. 3 slow raps, and then a familiar voice through the thin wooden door. "Jolene, open up. It's Gloria. I know you're in there because the kitchen light is still on, and you always forget to turn off the kitchen light when you're sad. Open the door, sweetheart. I brought food, and I brought something you need to see." Jolene opened the door, and Gloria Vance stood there, 52 years old. Silver hair pulled into a high tie, a round face with the warmest brown eyes Jolene had ever known. The woman who'd sold her coffee every morning at the corner convenience store for 3 years, and somehow become the spiritual mother Jolene no longer had. But tonight, Gloria looked different. Her coat askew, a bruise on her wrist, and those warm eyes carrying something Jolene recognized as the quiet anger of a gentle person pushed to the edge. Gloria stepped inside, set the bag of food on the table, then placed beside it a clear plastic envelope stuffed with papers. And Jolene looked at the envelope, and then at the bruise on Gloria's wrist. "What happened to you?" Gloria sat on the only chair in the studio, let out a breath, and told her. After hearing Jolene had been cut off from the hospital and fired from the restaurant, Gloria hadn't believed it. She knew Jolene, knew this girl wasn't capable of spying for anyone, let alone a criminal organization. This girl couldn't even lie convincingly. So Gloria did what? 10 years as a convenience store cashier, and 20 years before that, as a medical technician had taught her to do. She watched, she asked, she dug. She still kept contact with a few people in medical maintenance from her hospital days, and through an old friend working for the digital records storage company Morrison and Klein Mechanical used, she gained access to the backup system, where the original safety inspection report still existed, because when someone deletes a file from the main system, the automatic backup isn't erased, unless someone knows it's there, and Fausto clearly hadn't. The original report was in the envelope, and beside it something even more important. An email trail Gloria's friend extracted from the system. A chain of emails between Fausto Carbone and an address Gloria spent 2 days tracing through. 3 forwarding layers to identify as belonging to the Briggs family communication network. The emails didn't mention Petra or the heating system directly, but talked about the deal, the timing, the opportunity. And when placed next to the falsified report, the picture became unmistakably clear. Fausto wasn't just covering up a safety failure. He was betraying Renzo from the inside and using a rival family as leverage. Jolene looked at the stack of papers, then at the bruise on Gloria's wrist, and asked again, her voice lower. "What happened to you, Gloria?" Gloria glanced down at her wrist and then back up, her smile sad but not weak. "Last night, 2 men came to the store near closing time. They didn't rob the cash, didn't take anything. They just smashed the display case, overturned the shelves, and one of them grabbed my wrist and told me I should mind my own business. I know that kind of threat very well. The kind from people who know you're digging close to something they want buried. And I understood that if I kept going, it wouldn't just be a broken display case next time." Jolene took Gloria's hand, eyes wet. "Why did you keep going? Why didn't you stop?" Gloria squeezed Jolene's hand back, tighter, warmer, and her voice carried the weight of 20 years spent forgotten by the world. "Because I've been invisible for 10 years, Jolene. 10 years standing behind a register selling cigarettes and lottery tickets to strangers while my medical technician license expired and I couldn't afford to renew it. 10 years watching the knowledge in my head rot because no one would give me a chance to use it. And if finally being seen means being threatened, then at least I'm seen. At least I exist. At least I'm not a ghost behind glass customers look straight through." She placed a hand on Jolene's shoulder, her voice softening but firm at the core. "You're not invisible, Jolene. You never were. Your sister would be so proud of you. Now get up. That little girl still needs you. The proof is here. The truth is here. And this time, no one can throw it in the trash. Because this time, you're not handing it to a receptionist. This time, you're handing it to the only man with the power to change everything. And you'll look him in the eye and tell the truth the way you always have. Because it's the only thing you've got, and it's always been enough." Jolene looked at Gloria, looked at the envelope, looked at the bruise on the wrist of the woman who'd taken pain to bring her what no one else bothered to find, and something inside her, something that had gone dark at Oakwood Cemetery 2 days earlier, flickered back on. Not a roaring fire, just a small light, but enough to brighten a dark room, enough for her to stand, wipe her face, open the envelope, and begin to read. The obsidian room sat on the second floor of a red brick building in the West Loop. No sign, no neon, just a black painted steel door and two men in suits outside smoking, their eyes sweeping every direction, and Jolene stood on the opposite corner close to 11 at night, staring at that door, knowing that behind it was the man who had ordered her erased from his daughter's life, the man who believed she was a spy, the man who, if she was wrong about anything inside the envelope, pressed tight to her chest, could make this the last night she ever walked the streets of Chicago. She called Terry, the number he had disconnected after their last call, but Jolene didn't dial that one. She dialed the number Terry had saved for her on the first night at Lakewood Memorial, the personal number he'd given her when she was sitting in the hallway waiting for Petra's test results, a small gesture she hadn't understood then, but understood now, as proof that Terry had believed her before there was any reason to believe. He answered after 3 rings. Jolene spoke fast, not giving him time to hang up. "I'm outside the obsidian room. I have proof Fausto betrayed Renzo. I'm not a spy. Fausto is. He replaced the safety report. He contacted Briggs. I have the emails. I have the original report. It's all here. I just need to get inside and I need your help." The silence on the line stretched long enough for Jolene to hear the low music pulsing from inside the building. Then Terry spoke, his voice low and tight. "You know, if Fausto finds out, we're both dead, right?" Jolene looked at the black steel door, at the men in suits, at the envelope in her hands, and said, "That child doesn't deserve to die for politics. You knew that the first night when you gave me your personal number, instead of throwing me out and never looking back." Terry exhaled into the phone, and Jolene heard in that breath the sound of a man stepping over a line he couldn't step back from. "Go around to the alley and back, the kitchen door. Knock 3 times, then pause, then knock twice. I'll be there." The alley behind the obsidian room was dark and narrow, smelling of restaurant trash and standing rainwater. And when Jolene knocked in the right rhythm, the door opened, and yellow light from the kitchen spilled out. Terry standing there in his familiar black suit, but with a different face, harder, more resolved, the face of a man who had chosen his side. He didn't speak, just nodded, led her through the kitchen where cooks and servers looked but didn't ask. Because in places like this, people learn that not asking is how you live longest. Then up a service stairway, down a corridor lined with deep red carpet, to a heavy oak door where Terry stopped. He's inside, alone. This is when he doesn't want to be disturbed, and you're about to disturb him with news that his right hand of 15 years has been selling him to the enemy. So brace yourself. Jolene tightened her grip on the envelope, nodded, and Terry opened the door. The room beyond was unlike anything Jolene had ever entered. Dark wood-paneled walls, soft amber lighting, a billiards table in one corner, a black marble bar, and Renzo Valenti sitting in a leather chair at the far end, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his suit jacket off, black shirt sleeves rolled to reveal tattooed forearms she'd never seen. And when the door opened, he looked up, and his gray eyes froze the instant he recognized who stood there. "You were told to stay away." His voice didn't rise. It never did. But the danger in it was as clear as a round chambering. Jolene stepped inside, and she didn't know where the courage came from. Maybe from Gloria, from the bruise on her wrist, from the night at the cemetery, from the bottom she had hit, and discovered that when there's nothing left to lose, fear goes with it. "And your daughter was told she'd be safe in her own home?" she said, her voice steady, eyes locked on his. How did that work out? Renzo set the whiskey down slowly, and that slowness was more dangerous than any sudden move. He stood, a full head taller than her, his shadow falling over her as he stepped closer. "You're testing my limits, and you're wasting time doubting me while the real traitor is selling you to Briggs." The word stopped Renzo mid-step. Briggs. That name in this girl's mouth, in this room, carried a different weight, and Jolene saw it strike the wound he kept deepest, because Briggs was tied to Marin's death, and anything touching Briggs could pierce every layer of armor Renzo had built around himself. Jolene placed the envelope on the table between them. The original safety report from Morrison and Klein's backup system, showing the heating system failed inspection 3 months ago, replaced with a falsified version under Fausto's supervision, and an email chain traced through 3 forwarding layers between Fausto and the Briggs communication network, discussing the deal, the timing, the division of territory. "A friend of mine found these," Jolene said. and she was hurt for it. Her store was trashed for it. She still brought them to me because she believed in me. And I believe your daughter deserves the truth about the man who sits beside you every day." Renzo held her gaze for a long beat, then looked down at the envelope. He sat back down, opened it, and began to read. Jolene stood in silence, watching his face as he turned each page, and she saw the change seep in slowly like poison, from doubt to attention to focus to understanding to something deeper and darker, something she'd glimpsed in the ICU when the 32% result came back. But that time, the fury had been outward. This time it turned inward, the fury of a man realizing he'd been deceived by the very hand he trusted most, for the second time in his life, and each time nearly losing the person he loved most. Renzo reached the final page, set it down, and sat motionless with both hands flat on the table, eyes fixed on nothing, the room so quiet Jolene could hear ice cracking in the whiskey glass. When he looked up, his gray eyes were no longer cold. They burned, but with a cold burn, the burn of white phosphorus, no flame, yet everything scorched through. He took out his phone, dialed a single number, and spoke 4 words in the flattest voice Jolene had ever heard. "Bring Fausto here." Fausto Carbone entered the obsidian room 19 minutes after the call, and Jolene knew the instant he stepped through the door that he hadn't known she would be here, because those black eyes widened just enough, a fraction of a second, before the calm mask snapped back into place, and that single fraction told Jolene everything she needed to know. He hadn't prepared for this. He'd come thinking this was a routine summons from his boss, and her presence in this room had shattered every scenario he'd rehearsed. Renzo sat behind the table, spine straight, both hands flat on the wood, the opened envelope between them, papers aligned like cards already dealt. And he didn't look at Fausto as he entered. He looked at his whiskey glass, slowly rotating it between his fingers, and that refusal to look was more terrifying than any stare. "Sit," Renzo said. Fausto sat, his eyes flicking to Jolene, then to the envelope, then back to Renzo, and he began calculating. Jolene watched it happen in real time, the narrowing of his gaze, the faint tapping of fingers against his thigh, the way he scanned the room, assessing exits, assessing threats, assessing how many seconds remained before everything collapsed. Renzo slid the envelope across the table. "Explain." Fausto glanced down at the documents and played his first move, denial. "This is fabricated," he said, his voice still calm and professional. The voice of a loyal right hand being falsely accused. She, or whoever is behind her, staged all of this. I told you she was a Briggs spy, and now she's bringing forged evidence to drive a wedge between us. That's exactly Paxton Briggs's tactic. Divide and conquer. You know that. Renzo didn't react. No nod, no shake of the head, no change of expression. He only said, "Go on." Fausto tried to read him, and failed for the first time, because Renzo was showing him nothing. A flat surface that reflected nothing back, and Jolene saw the shift on Fausto's face, as calculation gave way to something less controlled, because he realized Renzo wasn't asking to hear the answer. Renzo was asking to see how long he'd keep lying. "I told you the safety report was verified." Fausto tried again, his voice harder. "Morrison and Klein are licensed contractors. Everything was approved through proper channels. Morrison confessed," Renzo said, and those 3 words landed like gunshots. Fausto froze. The fingers on his thigh stopped tapping, and for the first time since he'd entered the room, the mask cracked. Not shattered, just cracked, enough for Jolene to glimpse the real face of a man who knew he'd lost. The silence stretched 7 heartbeats. Jolene counted because her own heart was pounding hard enough to count with. Then Fausto changed tactics. From denial to justification, and the urgency in his voice was fear disguised as logic. "I did it for the family," Fausto said, leaning forward, speaking faster. "This was a $200 million deal. $200 million, Renzo. Money the family needed to expand, to hold its position, to keep Briggs from swallowing us whole. If that safety report failed inspection, the bank freezes everything, the deal dies, 2 years of preparation gone, and the girl just had a cold. Every doctor said so. No one mentioned carbon monoxide. How was I supposed to know? I'm not a doctor. I'm the man who keeps this empire standing. I gave 15 years to this family. 15 years. And I made a decision based on the information I had at the time. It was a business decision. It's what you taught me to do." The room went silent when Fausto stopped speaking, and Jolene heard her own breathing, shallow and fast, and she looked at Renzo and saw the most terrifying thing she'd ever witnessed. Not anger, she'd seen anger. This was what lay beyond it, where emotion had burned away completely, and only absolute clarity remained. "My daughter is the family," Renzo said, his voice so low Jolene had to lean forward to hear. "My daughter is the empire. My daughter is everything. 200 million, 2 billion, 20 billion. There isn't a number in this world worth a single breath Petra takes. You knew that. You held her when she was a baby. You sat at the dinner table with her. You looked into her eyes and you still chose money." Renzo stood, and the act of standing carried finality. He nodded once, and the door opened. 3 men entered. Terry Washington among them, but his face was sealed shut now. Not the Terry Jolene knew, but the Terry of this world, cold and professional, and they moved toward Fausto. Fausto rose, his chair scraping across the floor, and for a moment Jolene thought he might resist, but Fausto understood calculations. He'd lived by them, and the calculation now said resistance meant immediate death, while compliance meant time. So he allowed the men to take his arms. But as they led him past Jolene, he stopped, tilted his head toward her, and spoke softly enough that only she might hear, or perhaps he wanted Renzo to hear too. Jolene couldn't be sure. "You think you saved the girl? You just painted a target on your back. Every enemy of Valenti knows your face now, knows your name, knows you matter. And in this world, everyone who matters to Renzo Valenti shares the same ending. Ask his wife." The words struck Jolene's chest like a cold blade, and she stepped back half a pace. But before Fausto could say another word, Renzo was there, between them, his back to Jolene, shielding her completely, and he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every syllable carried. "Anyone who touches her answers to me. That's not a threat. It's a promise. And I keep my promises. Fausto, you know that better than anyone." Fausto looked at Renzo, then at Jolene behind his back. And the last smile on his face wasn't contempt, but the smile of a man memorizing. Then he was led from the room, the oak door closed, and silence returned. Renzo remained standing with his back to Jolene, and she looked at that broad back, the tension in his shoulders beneath the black shirt, and she understood with absolute clarity that she'd crossed a threshold she couldn't return from. She was no longer the invisible janitor from the South Side. She was the woman the most dangerous mafia boss in Chicago had just publicly claimed protection over in front of his traitorous right hand. And in this world, that declaration was both shield and chain, because it meant she was safe, and it also meant she belonged to a universe where every choice carried consequences, and every bond was a restraint. Renzo turned to her, and for the first time since the ICU, she didn't see steel in his gray eyes. She saw something tired, something lonely, something almost like gratitude but deeper. And he said, his voice stripped of all power and armor, "You were right, from the beginning, about everything, and I was wrong, about you." Jolene looked at him and didn't know what to say, because no book teaches you how to respond when a mafia boss apologizes with his eyes instead of words. So she said the only thing that still mattered, "How's Petra?" And something on Renzo's face shifted, just slightly, almost imperceptible, but Jolene saw it, because she always saw what others missed, and it looked like a crack in the wall he'd built around himself. Small, but light was beginning to get through. Petra recovered the way flowers bloom after winter. Slowly, in increments so small they were almost invisible. Yet each day brought a little more color back to her cheeks, a little more light into her dark eyes, a little more strength into the paper-thin voice that gradually thickened into the voice of a normal 7-year-old who knew how to laugh and how to demand. The hyperbaric oxygen chamber did its work. Dr. Vasquez tracked the carboxyhemoglobin levels dropping day by day, from 32 to 20, then 15, then 9, and with each falling number, Jolene released a breath she hadn't known she was holding until it left her lungs. Renzo kept his word. Jolene was allowed to visit Petra every day, with Terry driving her back and forth between the studio in Englewood and Lakewood Memorial. And Jolene didn't ask whether this was protection or surveillance, because she suspected the answer was both, and she didn't want to know which weighed more. Petra called her, "My Dawn Lady," and every time Jolene heard those words, something in her chest opened a little wider, something that had closed the night Bree died, and that she'd believed would never open again. She read stories to Petra, drew pictures with her using colored crayons on hospital paper, told her about Chicago from the point of view of someone who rode the L train at midnight, Stories Petra listened to with wide eyes, because her world until now had been the Lincoln Park mansion and private school and chauffeured cars with bodyguards. She'd never known that some people worked 2 jobs a day to pay rent, had never known that children lived in apartments without properly working heat. And with every story Jolene told, another door opened in Petra's mind, to a world beyond the crystal bubble her father had built. Renzo watched. Jolene knew he watched because she felt that gaze every time she sat beside Petra's bed, heavy and warm at the same time, a gaze she didn't dare return because she didn't know what she would find there, and she was afraid whatever it was would be more complicated than she could handle. Then small moments began to accumulate, like steady drops filling a glass neither of them pretended to see. One afternoon, Jolene nodded off in the chair beside Petra's bed, after 3 consecutive nights without sleep from worry, and because the apartment in Englewood had grown too cold since the heater broke, and she couldn't afford to fix it, and she woke to the smell of coffee. Not the kind from a vending machine, but rich and hot and somehow perfectly sweet. A paper cup set on the table beside her, and Renzo standing by the window as if he hadn't just brought coffee to a janitor dozing on a plastic hospital chair. She said thank you, and he nodded without turning. And it was the shortest conversation they'd ever had, yet somehow it said more than all the others. Another time late at night, Petra had fallen asleep, and Jolene stood to leave when Renzo entered. And they stood on opposite sides of the bed watching Petra sleep under soft light. And the silence between them was different, no longer the silence of strangers, but the silence of 2 people sharing something language couldn't name. Renzo brushed her shoulder as she passed toward the door, light and fleeting, perhaps accidental. But Jolene knew this man did nothing accidentally, and the place where he touched her grew warm, then spread like ink on wet paper. And she walked faster out of the room because she was afraid that if she stopped, she would turn around, and if she turned around, she would see something in his eyes she wasn't ready to see. But one night, the night Petra spiked a mild fever again, and Dr. Vasquez said it was a normal part of recovery, yet neither Jolene nor Renzo could sleep because 32% had etched fear into both their bones. Renzo sat down in the chair beside Jolene in the hallway outside Petra's room, and for the first time he spoke of Marin. She was the only person who ever made me want to be something other than what I am, Renzo said quietly, eyes on the opposite wall yet seeing something far beyond it. And they took her from me. Briggs ordered it, put a bomb in her car, on the way to pick Petra up from school. Petra lived because that day her teacher kept her 10 minutes late for a drawing that wasn't finished yet. 10 minutes. The difference between my daughter living or dying was a drawing that hadn't dried. He stopped, and Jolene saw his jaw clench, the way he held something inside that would destroy the room if he let it loose. After that, I became worse, colder, more brutal. Because if I couldn't protect the only thing that mattered, what use was being anything but a monster? At least monsters are feared, and if people are afraid, they don't dare touch what's mine. Jolene listened in silence, and when he stopped, she said something she didn't know she would say until it left her mouth. "You're not a monster." Renzo turned to look at her, and the distance between them in that hospital hallway at 2 a.m. was closer than she realized. Monsters don't sit by their daughter's bed for 3 nights without sleep. Monsters don't have trembling hands when they hold a 7-year-old's hand. Monsters don't cry when they think no one is watching. Renzo looked at her. "You saw that. I see everything people overlook," she said. "It's my curse." He didn't smile, but something on his face shifted. Something softened the way ice softens under sun. Not melting completely, but the surface beginning to glisten. What Jolene didn't know was that after that night, Renzo quietly had her life investigated, swiftly and thoroughly in the way of his world. And what he found wasn't a threat, but a portrait of a life so full of pain, it made him sit alone in his office at 4 a.m, reading it again and again. An alcoholic mother who died 2 years after Bree, funeral debt, hospital debt, 2 jobs, 14 hours a day. A studio apartment in the most dangerous part of Englewood. $370 a month, because no one else wanted to live there. No boyfriend, no family, nothing but pain and a courage she barely knew she possessed. And Bree, 16 years old, dead in an apartment owned by Glenfield Properties, a slumlord real estate company that specialized in buying cheap old buildings on the south side and renting them at high prices without maintenance. A company never prosecuted because it bribed Cook County inspectors. The same rot, the same lethal silence, the same way money turned poor people's deaths into business expenses no one ever paid for. Renzo closed the file and in the darkness of his office realized what he had known, but hadn't allowed himself to admit. This girl and he carried the same wound, losing the person they loved most to betrayal and greed, differing only in response. He chose to become a monster, and she chose silence, until silence meant letting another child die, and he didn't know which was braver. The next day in the hospital hallway, Jolene stepped out of Petra's room and nearly collided with Renzo approaching, the distance between them shrinking to almost nothing. She smelled coffee and cigarettes on his clothes. He looked down at her. She looked up, and something between them stretched tight like a drawn string on the verge of snapping. Not simple desire, but something older and sadder. The hunger to be seen by someone who understood, and Renzo tilted his head down slowly, and Jolene felt his breath on her lips, warm, and she closed her eyes. And then he stopped, a distance thinner than paper, yet wider than an ocean, and stepped back. "You should stay away from me, Jolene," he said hoarsely. "I'm not a good man." Jolene opened her eyes, looked at him, looked into gray eyes fighting between wanting and fear, and said, "I know exactly what you are, and I'm still standing here." Renzo looked at her for a heartbeat that felt like a lifetime, then turned and walked into Petra's room, and Jolene remained in the hallway with her back against the cold wall, heart pounding as if she'd run across the entire city, and she understood that what was happening between her and this man was more dangerous than any threat Fausto had ever sent, because threats she could run from, but this she didn't want to run from, and that was the real problem. 2 weeks after the night in the hospital hallway, Jolene received a call from Terry, not in the voice of a bodyguard on duty, but in the voice of someone she'd begun to think of as a friend, and he said the boss wanted to see her at the Valenti Holdings office on the Magnificent Mile at 10 in the morning, to bring anything she might need for the meeting. And when Jolene asked what the meeting was about, Terry only said that he thought she'd want to hear it for herself. Jolene arrived at the steel and glass 40-story building on North Michigan Avenue, wearing her worn heels and the only coat she owned, the one Gloria had bought for her at a Goodwill thrift store 2 years earlier, and she walked through the marble lobby with guards in suits, receptionists in silk blouses, and people scented with expensive perfume moving with the confidence of those who knew they belonged there. And Jolene felt the familiar ache of eyes on her, the way the world looks at someone who doesn't belong, but she kept her back straight, because she'd walked into a Mafia Boss's ICU room at midnight and looked Renzo Valenti in the eye without lowering her gaze. A corporate lobby was nothing. Terry met her on the 37th floor, led her down a carpeted hallway to a private conference room, and Renzo was already there, not alone. Petra sat beside him on a leather chair 3 times her size, color back in her cheeks, dark eyes lighting up when she saw Jolene, waving with an energy no one had believed possible 2 weeks earlier. "My Dawn lady." Jolene smiled, and smiling came easier now, and she sat in the chair Renzo pulled out for her as he slid a thick folder across the table embossed with the Valenti Holdings logo. Jolene opened it, and for the first few minutes she read without understanding, because she couldn't believe what she was reading. Then she started again, and this time every word fell into place. The Valenti Safety Initiative, a free environmental safety inspection program for low-income housing, schools, community centers, any place where the most vulnerable people lived and worked. 400 buildings in the first year. More after that, as many as it took until no child had to die from something invisible that a simple inspection should have caught. Jolene looked up, eyes wet but unblinking, because she was afraid if she blinked, the tears would fall, and she'd cry in front of this man again. "This is..." She stopped, swallowed. "This is the most incredible thing I've ever read. This could save so many lives." Renzo nodded, but there was no pride on his face, only a tired honesty Jolene had begun to recognize during late nights in hospital corridors. "It isn't enough. It'll never be enough to make up for the damage done by people who put profit before safety. But it's a start." He paused, and for the first time Jolene saw Renzo Valenti look uncertain, the usual confidence of the boss giving way to something close to unease, as if what he was about to say mattered more than any deal he'd ever negotiated. "And I want you to run it. All of it. Build the team. Set priorities. Make every decision. It's yours." Jolene nearly dropped the folder, her hands shaking as she reflexively shook her head. "No, I don't. I don't have the credentials. I'm a janitor who dropped out of college in my 3rd year, because after Bree died, I completely fell apart, and my mother drank herself to death, and I couldn't afford tuition. I'm not qualified to run something like this. You're more qualified than anyone with a 12 degrees," Renzo said with the same steel he used when he believed something absolutely. "You see what others overlook. You care when it's inconvenient. You speak up when it's terrifying. You walked into a mafia boss's hospital and told him his own people were killing his daughter. That isn't something they teach in classrooms. He leaned forward, voice softening. I'm offering a fair salary, full benefits, including health and retirement, and funding for you to finish your environmental engineering degree, however long it takes. No pressure, if you want it. Petra, who'd sat quietly through the conversation with a patience unusual for a 7-year-old, leaned across the table and took Jolene's hand. That small hand, far stronger than 2 weeks earlier. Warmer, steadier, the hand of a child who was living instead of dying. Please say yes, she said with a seriousness almost funny, if it hadn't been so piercingly sincere. We can go inspect buildings together, make sure other kids are safe like you kept me safe. We can be a team. I'll help. I'll draw pictures to make people happy. Jolene looked at Petra, then Renzo, then the folder on the table, and felt something shift inside her. Not excitement, but something deeper and more permanent. Purpose, the chance to turn the greatest loss of her life into protection for others, to turn Bree's death into something beyond pain. Okay, yes, but on one condition. Renzo looked up. Say it, anything. Gloria Vance, the woman who brought me the evidence when I was at rock bottom. She used to be a medical technician. She's worked as a convenience store cashier for 10 years because her certification expired, and she couldn't afford recertification. Hire her as an advisor. Fund her recertification. She sees everything. Notices details others miss. She's been invisible as long as I have. Renzo nodded immediately, already making a note. Done. I'll call her today. Anyone else? Terry Washington, Jolene said. And she saw a flicker of surprise in Renzo's eyes, but no objection. He helped me when he didn't have to. He broke rules because he believed me, because he chose what was right over what was safe for his job. People like that, people who choose right over rules when it matters. They're rare. We need someone like that as a community liaison. I'll speak to him today. He'll have a position if he wants it. Jolene stood, folder in hand, ready to say thank you and leave, because she didn't know what else to say. But Renzo stood as well, came around the table, and took her hand, not firmly, not threateningly, just gently, his large warm hand enclosing her cracked smaller one. And this was the first time he touched her with deliberate tenderness. Not a brush on the shoulder, not an accidental hallway contact, but a choice to hold her hand and not let go. Thank you, he said, his voice stripped of every layer, the voice of a man rather than a boss, for saving Petra, for being brave enough to step into my world, to stay, not just for the foundation, stay because this place has been dark for too long, and you're the first light to walk through the door in 3 years. Jolene looked at his hand holding hers, then up into gray eyes she'd learned to read during long nights in hospital hallways, and spoke honestly. I don't belong to your world, Renzo. He didn't release her hand. You don't belong to any world they try to place you in. That's exactly what makes you extraordinary. Petra watched them from the oversized leather chair, chin in her hands, smiling the smile of a 7-year-old who sees 2 adults holding hands and understands instinctively that something good is beginning, even if she doesn't yet have the words to name it. Fausto Carbone vanished from Chicago in silence, the kind of disappearance no one questions in Renzo Valenti's world, no one mentions, no one searches for. His name erased from every Valenti Holdings record, every account he'd accessed frozen, every line of communication severed, and those who once worked under him learned quickly how to forget he'd ever existed. Because in this world, forgetting is the most efficient form of execution. But the consequences of what Fausto concealed didn't vanish with him. Renzo allowed just enough disclosure about the safety failure at the Lincoln Park mansion to trigger a formal investigation without exposing the family's underground operations. And the legal machine of Valenti Holdings played that chess match flawlessly, transparent enough to earn press praise, controlled enough to keep anyone from digging deeper than necessary. OSHA launched a comprehensive investigation. The contractor Morrison and Klein Mechanical was heavily fined and permanently lost its license. Morrison himself faced criminal charges for signing a falsified report, and the inquiry uncovered that Morrison and Klein wasn't the only contractor cutting corners. Across Chicago, dozens of maintenance companies had been falsifying safety checks for years because lax oversight and bribing Cook County inspectors were far cheaper than doing repairs properly. New protocols were established: independent inspections, cross-reporting, anonymous whistleblower systems, and for the first time in Chicago's administrative history, Low-level workers were encouraged to report safety hazards without fear of retaliation. Yet the real change didn't come from laws or new procedures. It came from something quieter, something no statute could mandate. In staff break rooms and waiting areas in hospitals across Chicago, janitors and aides and security guards and operations workers, people passed by every day without noticing, that began speaking up about small dangers they'd long recognized, but never voiced, because no one asked. Frayed wiring in basements, leaking pipes near electrical panels, fire alarms disabled because the noise bothered patients, ventilation systems with strange odors no one checked, loose gas connections in kitchens. And more than anything, people began to listen. Managers held meetings with cleaning staff. Administrators demanded safety reports from every department, not just supervisors. The invisible became visible, and that visibility spread farther than anyone expected. Other companies announced similar safety funds. Medical schools began teaching students to value input from every worker, regardless of rank, and the phrase Jolene Protocol became shorthand for listening to frontline workers, even though Jolene herself was never comfortable hearing her name used that way. The Valenti Safety Initiative opened its doors in a small West Loop space, flooded with light from large windows and the energy of new beginnings. And on the first morning, Jolene stood at the entrance, looking inside, barely believing it was real. Gloria Vance arrived first, her medical advisor badge clipped to her chest, touching it every few minutes as if afraid it might vanish. And when Jolene asked if she was all right, Gloria said 10 years. 10 years? I stood behind a cashier counter, and now I'm wearing a badge with my name and my title, and someone is paying me for what I know, instead of for knowing how to work a register. You ask if I'm all right? I'm more than all right. Terry Washington arrived next, new suit but the same smile, taking on the role of community liaison. And as he shook Jolene's hand, he said, "Do you remember the first night I threw you out of Lakewood Memorial?" And Jolene said she did. And Terry said, "That was the first time in 8 years of security work I wanted to disobey an order, and I'm glad I finally did." A small team of engineers and inspectors Jolene had carefully selected not only for expertise but for empathy, for the ability to see people behind numbers and standards, filled the desks, and Jolene looked at them and felt something she'd thought she'd never feel again after Bree. Hope. Not the fragile kind that shatters easily, but the kind with structure, with action, with people standing beside you. On the wall opposite the front door, Jolene hung a photograph. Bree, 16 years old. 13, actually, since the picture was taken 3 years before she died. Grinning into the camera, hair flying in the wind, and behind her the Chicago sky at dawn, orange and gold and purple, full of dreams that never had the chance to happen. Beneath the photograph, Jolene wrote in careful script, "Listen to the quiet voices. They might save your life." And every morning when Jolene stepped into the office, she looked at that photograph, at her sister's smile, and whispered Bree's name, not as a prayer, but as a promise, a memorial stronger than any stone marker at Oakwood Cemetery, because a headstone only says Bree lived. But this foundation proves that Bree is still saving people, every day, through the cracked hands of a sister who turned pain into action and loss into purpose. 6 months later, spring touched Chicago with gentle hands, snow melting along Michigan Avenue sidewalks, the first green buds pushing through in Lincoln Park, and inside Lakewood Memorial Hospital, Dr. Noel Vasquez signed Petra Valenti's discharge papers with the smile she'd waited 6 long months to wear. Perfect health, no trace of carbon monoxide left in her blood, no permanent brain damage, a medical miracle she knew wasn't a miracle at all, but the result of someone seeing what an entire team of the best doctors in Illinois had missed. That morning, before the sun rose, Jolene arrived at the hospital with 2 cups of hot chocolate and a promise that needed keeping. Petra was already dressed, sitting on the bed swinging her legs, cheeks pink, dark eyes bright, and when she saw Jolene, she jumped down and ran to her, wrapping her in the strong arms of a healthy 7-year-old, arms that 6 months earlier had trembled so badly they could barely hold a stranger's finger through a hospital rail. "Come on, sweetheart," Jolene said, eyes wet but smiling. "We have a promise to keep." The 3 of them went up to the hospital roof by a fire stairwell Terry had arranged ahead of time, Jolene holding Petra's hand, Renzo walking behind, and when they pushed the steel door open to the Chicago sky, the early morning wind carried the scent of flowers and fresh rain. Jolene led Petra to the railing and the 3 of them stood there, shoulders touching, facing east where the city skyline cut into a sky coming alive. Petra had never woken early enough to see this. In her old life of late nights and late mornings, dawn was something she slept through, something she took for granted. But now, as the sky shifted from black to deep blue, to violet to orange to blazing gold, as the first light spilled over the horizon, painting the clouds with hope and promise, Petra understood with the pure instinct of a child who had nearly lost everything and been given everything back. She understood why dawn mattered, why every new day was a gift, why some people woke early just to watch the sky change and cry from gratitude. "See?" Jolene whispered. "Dawn is real." Petra smiled, eyes shining with tears and joy. "It's so beautiful. I finally see it. Bree would have loved this so much." "She really would have," Jolene agreed softly. "She truly would have." Renzo stood behind them, and Jolene felt his presence before she felt his hand settle on her shoulder. Warm, steady, a hand that had broken bones now resting on her shoulder as gently as on a flower petal. And she turned to look at him, and he looked at her. And there in the dawn light on a Chicago hospital roof with the whole city waking beneath them, Renzo Valenti, the most ruthless mafia boss in the city, the man whose name silenced judges and made police look away, bent down and kissed the bravest floor cleaner he'd ever met. Gently, slowly, like a promise, like dawn, like the way light touches darkness, not with violence, but with patience. And darkness gives way not because it loses, but because it's waited too long for the light. Jolene closed her eyes and felt that kiss with everything inside her. With 5 years of loneliness, with the pain of losing Bree, with silent nights mopping hospital floors, with worn heels and cracked hands, and a heart that once believed it would never feel anything but loss. And when she opened her eyes, Renzo was still there, still close, and for the first time in 3 years, those gray eyes were no longer cold. Petra looked up at them, smiled with the knowing smile of a child, then turned back to the sunrise and said, "My dawn lady, Dad needs dawn too, right?" Jolene laughed, and Renzo laughed, and the sound of the three of them blended with the Chicago morning wind, rising above the hospital roof, drifting across the city, light and warm and full of hope. Later, as Jolene walked home through streets that no longer felt lonely, she thought about this story and realized that in the end it wasn't a story about a mafia boss or a medical miracle. It was a story about something more fragile and more powerful and more human, a moment of connection, a decision to listen, a small voice that refused silence when silence meant death, and a dawn that proved night always passes. Heroes don't always wear capes or carry guns. Sometimes they wear worn shoes and cleaning gloves. Sometimes they're the people we pass every day without seeing. And sometimes the most dangerous man in the city loves the bravest woman he's ever met, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she was shaking with fear and still did the right thing. This story reminds us that every person, no matter their place in life, has the power to create change if they dare to speak and dare to care. That human worth doesn't live in degrees or bank accounts, but in the heart, in the quiet courage of ordinary days, when no one is watching. If this story touched your heart, please like it so more people can hear it. Share it with someone who needs to know that small voices can shake even the loudest rooms. And subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our daily moving stories. We want to know how you felt about Jolene and Renzo's story. Did it remind you of someone in your real life? Was there a moment that made you cry, or made you want to speak up for someone the world has overlooked? Share in the comments below. We read every comment, and we want to hear what's in your heart, because every story you share with us matters as much as the stories we share with you. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace in every day, and remember that every dawn is proof that night will pass. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.